Hey guys, tonight we wander into the silent corridors of power, where golden chandeliers glint off polished floors and every echo hides a secret. You probably won't survive this without feeling a chill creep up your spine. Or maybe that's just a draft from a half-open palace window. The air smells faintly of aged wood and candle smoke, and you can almost hear whispers bouncing off the walls. Whispers that have been murmured for centuries, but never spoken aloud in daylight. Tonight, we'll trace the hidden patterns of ambition, betrayal, and obsession lurking behind the polished veneer of royal life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment your location and local time. I want to know who's wandering these shadows with me tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step lightly over the marble floors of a European palace, imagining the echoes of silk gowns brushing past the tapestries. The walls are thick, and every portrait seems to watch you, eyes flickering in candlelight, judging your intrusion. Scholars still argue whether these opulent displays were merely vanity or a calculated effort to conceal the darker truths of monarchy, but as you wander deeper, it feels like every gilded frame hides a story of whispered schemes, hidden loves, and threats cloaked in polite conversation. One corner of the hallway houses a small cabinet with intricate carvings. You notice it quivers slightly as if someone recently touched it. Oddly enough, it is not locked, yet you hesitate to peek inside. Perhaps some things are meant to remain unseen. As you continue down the corridor, your mind drifts to the idea of appearances. Every royal family projected an image of order, divine right, but behind closed doors, chaos often reigned. A chandelier swings gently, and a draft from a hidden window stirs the heavy curtains. You catch the faint scent of incense lingering, a tool not just for fragrance, but for masking less savory odors of long-kept secrets. Historians have suggested that palaces themselves were constructed as labyrinths, not only to impress visitors, but also to protect and hide illicit affairs, conspiracies, and, occasionally, murder. You can almost imagine young princes and princesses learning to navigate these halls, aware that every turn could bring them face to face with danger disguised as decorum. In the corner of the gallery, there's a painting of a king whose smile doesn't reach his eyes. Beneath the surface of his royal pose lies a hint of unease, perhaps paranoia. Oddly, he is holding a small object in his hand that looks like a tiny dagger, barely visible if you squint. Quirky details like this pepper the portraits of royalty, snakes subtly woven into a brooch, a barely discernible shadow that hints at someone else's presence. You feel a shiver, because it's almost like the artist was whispering a secret only the keenest observer could catch. The more you notice, the clearer it becomes. Power was not merely performed, it was hidden, layered, and encoded in symbols meant to be understood only by those who dared look too closely. Moving further along, you find yourself in a dimly lit library. Shelves of ancient books tower above you, their spines cracked and faded. Scholars still debate whether the written records of royal families are entirely accurate, given that scribes often manipulated history to protect or embellish reputations. You run your fingers along the edges of these volumes, sensing that each book carries both knowledge and deception. A candle flickers nearby, casting shadows that resemble watchful figures. One tome, slightly ajar, seems almost to beckon. You pull it free, revealing letters bound in red wax. The handwriting is elegant, deliberate. As you skim the first line, you realize these may not be public documents. These are the private communications that reveal true motivations, alliances, and betrayals, details carefully hidden from official records. Take a moment to step back and imagine the people who once roamed these halls. A queen, perhaps, adjusting her veil, glancing cautiously over her shoulder to ensure her conversation with a confidant remains unheard. A prince pacing in silence, rehearsing words that could destroy or save lives. Servants moving discreetly, carrying messages or medicines, sometimes with knowledge far beyond what the young royals imagined. The sheer human drama hidden behind the golden surfaces is staggering. Oddly, while these secrets feel heavy, there's a strange allure, a magnetic pull that makes you want to keep exploring, to uncover every hidden corner of this opulent cage, pause at a long corridor lined with mirrors. Your reflection wavers in the candlelight, multiplying into dozens of eyes that seem to follow your every move. Scholars still argue whether mirrors were placed for practical reasons or as a psychological tool to remind royals that they were constantly observed, even when alone. It's disorienting, but in a way that sharpens your senses. You notice tiny imperfections in the glass, scratches that could hide messages or symbols. Perhaps someone, long ago, etched a mark as a warning, a secret code for another member of the household. You feel almost complicit in stepping into these spaces, like a trespasser witnessing things you were never meant to see. A faint sound draws you to another room. It's a soft scratching, almost imperceptible, as if the walls themselves are trying to communicate. You push the door open slowly and enter a study filled with maps and charts. Oddly, one map has pins marking locations you don't recognize. Could these be battle plans, secret estates, or hidden treasures? Scholars still debate the strategic genius of these placements versus the possibility of mere whimsy, a way for the royals to amuse themselves while hiding dangerous truths from enemies and allies alike. You can't help but lean closer, imagining the conversations that took place here, whispers of intrigue that could change the fate of kingdoms. As you continue through the palace, the temperature seems to drop slightly. Perhaps it's the stone walls, or perhaps it's the weight of centuries of secrets pressing down on you. You pass a tapestry depicting a ceremonial procession. At first glance, it's elegant, regal, and orderly, but a second look reveals figures partially hidden in shadows, watching, perhaps plotting. Quirky details abound. A small dog with a collar that has a miniature dagger etched into it, a banner with a symbol not recorded in official history. It's these tiny anomalies that give you the feeling that the past is breathing around you, waiting to be deciphered by someone patient enough to notice. Finally, you stop before a massive set of double doors. They are carved with intricate patterns, and as your hand rests on the handle, you hesitate. Behind them lie stories, histories, and secrets that may never be fully revealed. You think back to everything you've glimpsed tonight: whispers in the hall, eyes in portraits, letters hidden from public view. All of it paints a picture of royal life that is dazzling, dangerous, and disturbingly human. As you take a deep breath, you realize that even in opulence, no one is free from fear, manipulation, or hidden truths. And as you prepare to step forward, the palace seems to sigh, as if acknowledging your presence in its long hidden corridors. You wander into a quieter wing of the palace, where the air feels heavier, almost thick with the weight of generations. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors line the walls, each with a rigid posture and eyes that seem to judge your every step. You notice a recurring theme: family members striking similar poses, sharing the same sharp cheekbones, piercing gaze. Scholars still argue whether this was intentional vanity or an early example of what we now recognize as inbreeding. You squint at the plaques beneath the paintings. Names are repeated across centuries, a silent testament to the royal obsession with preserving pure bloodlines. The idea of purity here is both literal and symbolic. Royals believed that their lineage was sacred, almost divine, and any deviation from that line was considered a threat to the stability of their kingdom. Oddly, this pursuit of perfection often led to tragic consequences. You imagine children born with strange ailments, barely surviving infancy, while parents continued the cycle in the name of heritage. In some dynasties, it wasn't uncommon for cousins or even uncles and nieces to marry, a practice that modern genetics would cringe at. Walking past a small balcony, you catch the faint echo of a nurse humming to a baby in the distance. Sound meant to soothe, but in context, it feels eerie, almost like a lullaby for fragile legacies. You pause near a desk stacked with journals, pages yellowed with age. One particular entry catches your eye. It's a meticulous chart, tracking lineage and genetic traits across generations. Scholars still debate whether such records were purely administrative or part of a deeper, almost obsessive ritual to monitor purity. You trace the lines with your finger, noting repeated patterns of early deaths, odd deformities, and unusually bright minds, all within the same family branches. There's a certain quirkiness in the obsession, the way royal scribes recorded even the most mundane details, as if every sneeze or smile mattered in the grand scheme of bloodlines. The palace corridors feel colder now. As you move deeper into the wing reserved for the youngest heirs, their rooms are lavish, yet eerily sparse. Dolls, toys, and tiny swords lie abandoned in corners. Scholars still argue whether the strict upbringing of royal children was a necessity or cruelty disguised as tradition. You notice a small mirror hanging low on the wall, with subtle etchings around its frame. Oddly, it seems intended for children to see themselves frequently, a tool to instill awareness of appearance, posture, and perhaps inheritance. The mirror almost whispers that these children were never allowed to be just themselves. They were born into roles, scripted centuries in advance. In the nursery, the faint scent of lavender mingles with the ever-present stone coolness. You see tiny cribs, each labeled with gold lettering, each bearing the family crest. Odd details abound. A carved animal on one crib has a toothy grin, as though mocking its occupant, while another crib has a hidden compartment beneath its mattress, possibly for secret messages or medicines. Scholars still debate whether such features were practical, whimsical, or a combination of both. You step closer, imagining the children's eyes wide with curiosity or fear, learning early that even their playthings were extensions of political and familial expectations. Moving to a long hallway adorned with ancestral armor, you feel the weight of generations pressing in. Each suit tells a story of battles fought, victories won, and alliances maintained. Yet, behind the shine, you can sense the personal costs. Lives ended too soon, marriages arranged not for love but for strategy, and a relentless pressure to preserve bloodlines above all else. Oddly, in this armory, one helmet stands apart, small and intricately detailed, clearly meant for a child who never reached adulthood. Scholars still argue whether it was ceremonial or a grim reminder of mortality within the royal family. You step into a small study adjoining the hallway. Scrolls and ledgers litter the desk, each meticulously documenting births, marriages, and deaths. One ledger details an unusual pattern. Several cousins married within a single generation, each union carefully orchestrated to maintain the family's divine essence. Quirky marginal notes reveal superstitions tied to these unions, lucky charms, and ritual blessings meant to ensure the bloodline remained untainted. Scholars still debate the effectiveness and reasoning behind such practices. But walking among these pages, it's clear the obsession was real, almost palpable. The more you move through the palace, the more vivid the juxtaposition becomes. Luxury and opulence on one hand, and a quiet, relentless pressure on the other. You imagine children learning the nuances of court, life almost before they could walk, expected to smile, to bow, to inherit not only a crown, but centuries of expectations and secrecy. Oddly, you notice small sketches etched into the stone floor near the windows. Children's doodles, perhaps moments of rebellion, small acts of individuality trying to emerge in an environment designed for conformity. Scholars still argue whether such acts were signs of resistance or simply childish innocence. But the contrast is haunting. Finally, you reach a chamber filled with genealogical charts stretching floor to ceiling. The walls are crisscrossed with red threads connecting faces and names, forming a web of intrigue. It's dizzying to trace the paths, to follow generations of careful planning, manipulation, and sometimes tragic mistakes. Oddly, a single chart bears a small black mark over one child's portrait, the reason long forgotten, or perhaps deliberately erased. Scholars still debate whether these omissions were accidental or deliberate. Acts 2 hide scandal, disease, or political inconvenience. Standing there, you can't help but feel the weight of centuries of obsession, the quiet tragedies hidden behind polished portraits in gilded frames, all in the name of maintaining a pure bloodline. As you leave the room, the chill in the air seems to linger, brushing against your neck. You glance back at the wall of charts, realizing that history often celebrates the grandeur while hiding the human cost. And yet, even in their pursuit of perfection, these families left subtle traces, odd details, whispers of vulnerability, and glimpses of the humanity that persisted behind the throne. You walk away with the unsettling awareness that the quest for purity, however noble it may have seemed, carried shadows far darker than the golden halls could ever reveal. You step into a different realm now, far from European marble and gilded halls, and find yourself on the sun-baked stones of ancient Egypt. The air is dry, warm, and carries the faint scent of sand and papyrus. Scholars still argue whether the grandeur of the pyramids and temples was primarily a display of power or a reflection of deep spiritual obsession. But walking among the massive columns, you feel both awe and unease. The pharaohs, draped in gold and linen, wielded authority that extended far beyond the mortal realm. But behind the ceremonial headdresses and meticulously carved statues, their lives held obsessions far stranger than you might expect. You wandered through a temple complex, imagining a pharaoh in his private quarters, the cool stone beneath his feet a welcome relief from the scorching sun. Oddly, some chambers are decorated not with gods or victories, but with intricate carvings of animals, stars, and symbols whose meanings remain mysterious even today. Scholars still debate whether these images were purely religious, coded messages, or personal talismans. You trace the lines of a carved serpent, noticing how it coils around a sun disk, almost like it's guarding some hidden knowledge. It's hard not to feel that these rulers were fixated not only on power, but on eternity, seeking ways to preserve their essence long after death. In a secluded inner courtyard, you spot a small shrine, far less elaborate than the grand temples outside. Candles flicker in your imagination, casting shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. Odd details jump out. A miniature model of a chariot, tiny gold inlays depicting hunts, and symbols that scholars still argue could represent secret rituals or personal pleasures kept from the public eye. You can picture the pharaoh kneeling here, whispering prayers, performing ceremonies that were as much about personal obsession as about piety. There's a hint of indulgence, a quiet fixation that contrasts sharply with the public persona of divine ruler. As you move through the royal quarters, you begin to notice the layering of secrecy. One room is filled with mirrors that reflect endless columns of light and shadow, perhaps designed to disorient and isolate. Scholars still debate whether these mirrored chambers served religious purposes, psychological control, or personal amusement. Oddly, in one corner, you spot a small chest with faint scratches forming a pattern. Perhaps it contained personal treasures, forbidden texts, or even items of obsession that the pharaoh never wanted seen. You can almost hear the faint echo of footsteps, imagining servants or guards quietly moving about, careful not to disturb the privacy of their sovereign. You climb a narrow staircase, leading to a balcony overlooking the Nile. The sun glints off the water, painting the river in molten gold, yet your attention is drawn to a more subtle obsession. The pharaoh's fascination with astronomy, stars, and cycles of the moon is evident in the carvings along the railing. Oddly, a tiny depiction of a rare celestial event catches your eye: comet, perhaps, or an eclipse. Scholars still argue whether such carvings were mere records or a reflection of a deep, personal fixation with cosmic patterns and their own place within them. You feel the weight of these obsessions pressing across centuries, invisible yet tangible. In a private chamber, there's a collection of unusual artifacts, tiny statues, jewelry with hidden compartments, and scrolls detailing ceremonies known only to the inner court. Oddly, one scroll seems less about state affairs and more about indulgences, private hunts, or exotic animals kept close for pleasure. Scholars still debate how much these activities were about demonstrating wealth and power versus satisfying personal fascination. You lean closer, imagining the pharaoh moving among these objects, each one a window into secret desires and private rituals, carefully concealed from the public eye. A faint scent of incense drifts through the air in your mind, intertwining with the dry aroma of papyrus. You pause to consider the pharaoh's fixation on immortality, elaborate tombs, hidden chambers, and secret passages designed to protect not only wealth but the essence of the ruler. Odd details are everywhere: a small carving of a jackal in a corner, an unusual arrangement of stones, or a miniature model of servants carrying offering. Scholars still argue whether these were symbolic, ritualistic, or obsessive gestures aimed at controlling the afterlife. You shiver, realizing how meticulously every detail was planned to satisfy both ambition and personal fixation. As you wander through a quiet hallway, you find yourself reflecting on the paradox of power and obsession. A ruler who commands armies and lands can still be preoccupied with the tiniest of personal curiosities. Oddly, this intimacy of obsession humanizes the pharaohs, even as it underscores the isolation of absolute authority. Scholars still debate how these personal indulgences influence political decisions or the treatment of their subjects. But walking here, you feel the complex, often contradictory nature of a ruler consumed by both the divine and the personal. You step into a burial chamber replica, imagining the pharaohs inspecting their tombs, ensuring every statue, every relief, and every offering is perfectly placed. Oddly, some of the miniature figurines seem slightly out of proportion, perhaps a reflection of personal whims or secret messages, meant only for the ruler or a trusted few. Scholars still argue whether such details were artistic conventions or intentional, quirks revealing personal eccentricities. You move closer, noticing a small alcove behind a statue. Perhaps it was a hiding place for a treasured object or a secret ritual item. The weight of centuries presses down, making the space feel alive with unspoken stories. Finally, you ascend a narrow staircase to a rooftop terrace. The Nile stretches endlessly before you, and the setting sun bathes the palace in a golden glow. You imagine the pharaohs standing here alone, observing the stars, the river, and the lands they command. Oddly, the obsession with control, beauty, and secrecy seems almost poetic in this quiet moment. Scholars still debate how much these personal affected the dynasty's stability. But for you, the lesson is clear. Behind every gilded mask lies a human being consumed by private passions, ambitions, and secrets that history only hints at. You breathe deeply, letting the warmth of the sun and the cool river breeze mingle, a reminder that even the greatest obsessions are grounded in human desire. You step quietly into the dimly lit corridors of another palace, this one shaped by intricate arches and endless tapestries. The air is scented with a faint mixture of rose water and candle smoke, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing down around you. Scholars still argue whether the power of queens was ever truly independent or always mediated by male counterparts. But walking through these halls, it becomes clear that influence doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes, the most formidable rulers operate from the shadows, guiding decisions, shaping policy, and bending the course of kingdoms without ever appearing in official histories. You pause before a narrow doorway that opens into a small chamber, almost hidden from the main hall. Oddly, it's sparsely decorated. A simple table, a chair, and a few ledgers. You can imagine a queen sitting here late at night, reviewing letters and reports by candlelight, her thoughts reaching further than any public decree. Scholars still debate how much of official governance was influenced by these hidden hands versus formal councils, but the evidence in letters and private correspondence hints at quiet, relentless control. You notice the faint indentation on the table where she may have rested her elbows, a subtle reminder that power is often exercised in silence, in private moments rather than on grand stages. As you move deeper into the chambers, you catch glimpses of personal effects, an embroidered handkerchief here, a carved comb there, each item meticulously chosen to convey a sense of grace and refinement. Oddly, some objects seem almost ceremonial, too delicate to be used, suggesting they were more symbols than tools. Scholars still argue whether these artifacts reflected the queen's personal tastes, political signaling, or a combination of both. You trace your fingers lightly along a set of vellum letters, imagining her writing late into the night, instructing generals, arranging alliances, and shaping the destiny of her realm from behind layers of velvet curtains. A faint echo of footsteps seems to follow you as you enter a long gallery lined with portraits. Oddly, many of these paintings depict queens with serene expressions, yet subtle details: an angled hand, a sideways glance, a shadow behind the crown hint at their deeper ambitions and secret influence. Scholars still debate whether these portraits were meant to display submission or strength, but walking past them, you sense that these women communicated volumes through silence, posture, and subtle cues. Each brushstroke is a message to those who knew how to read it, and a mystery to the casual observer. You wander into a smaller antechamber, where a large mirror reflects the flickering candlelight. Oddly, the mirror seems almost like a secret confidant, reflecting not just her image, but her presence in ways no one else might notice. Scholars still argue whether mirrors in royal quarters were purely decorative or used as tools for psychological control, or ritual. You run your fingers along the frame, noticing tiny inscriptions, perhaps prayers, reminders, or cryptic symbols meant only for her eyes. It's a tangible connection to the quiet power exerted in secrecy. As you explore further, you come across a narrow staircase spiraling down into the palace's lower levels. Oddly, it feels more like a passage to another world than a simple stairwell. Scholars still debate whether these hidden passages were practical escape routes, secret meeting places, or simply architectural whims. But walking down, you imagine a queen slipping through these shadows to meet allies, deliver orders, or observe court affairs unseen. The air grows cooler, carrying a faint scent of damp stone and candle wax, reminding you that power, even when exercised quietly, often resides in the less visible corners of a grand structure. In the lower chambers, you notice ledgers, small maps, and coded letters carefully stored. Oddly, a small key rests atop a leather-bound book, perhaps to lock away correspondence too sensitive for anyone else to see. Scholars still argue about the authenticity and interpretation of such documents, but each artifact provides a glimpse into how women wielded influence, without titles or armies, through intelligence, discretion, and the management of information. You imagine her smile at a clever maneuver, her satisfaction in orchestrating events while remaining unseen, a queen ruling not from the throne, but from the shadows where true power often hides. You emerge back into the main hall, your footsteps muted against the polished stone. Oddly, the grand tapestries seem to ripple, as though they remembered the countless plans, intrigues, and quiet victories carried out under the watchful eyes of these shadow queens. Scholars still debate whether history has adequately credited them, but the subtle traces remain. Letters, objects, mirrors, inscriptions, and even the architecture itself. Each tells a story of influence that defies the pageantry of official chronicles, reminding you that power is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, and the wisest rulers know exactly how to listen. Finally, you pause before a massive set of double doors leading to the council chamber. Oddly, they remain closed, and yet you feel the invisible presence of a queen inside, shaping every decision, weighing every strategy. Scholars still debate the exact extent of these women's authority, but for you, the lesson is clear. Ruling from the shadows is an art form, demanding patience, intelligence, and subtlety. And in those quiet moments, these queens often held more sway than any king appearing on the throne. You step back, taking in the hushed grandeur of the palace, aware that the true architects of history are not always the ones celebrated in stone or verse. You find yourself wandering through the ornate gardens of a sprawling royal palace, the scent of jasmine and roses mingling with the warm evening air. Scholars still argue whether these gardens were designed solely for beauty or also for secret meetings and clandestine affairs. But as you step along the winding pathways, it becomes clear that love within royal walls was rarely simple. Forbidden relationships between cousins, advisors, or rivals often carried stakes far higher than mere hearts. They threatened alliances, succession, and sometimes even lives. You imagine lovers meeting beneath the shade of a citrus tree, whispering with eyes darting toward the windows of looming towers. Oddly, one statue depicts a pair entwined in an embrace, but subtle carving errors make it look almost like one figure is holding the other hostage. Curious reflection of the precarious nature of romance among royals. You follow a narrow marble path to a secluded fountain, its water glittering in the moonlight. Scholars still debate whether some of these secret liaisons were genuinely romantic or purely strategic, designed to consolidate power or manipulate influence. Oddly, petals float across the water, arranged by the gardener Zor, perhaps, by secret hands into patterns that almost look like letters. You bend closer, imagining a lover leaving coded messages for a partner. A red rose to signify danger, a white one for trust, and perhaps a single yellow petal signaling betrayal. It's a quiet reminder that in these palaces, even love had to be negotiated carefully, measured in symbols, and often hidden behind layers of deception. You wander past an intricately carved trellis and enter a shadowed corridor leading to the private chambers of a prince and his secret beloved. Oddly, a small, hidden door swings slightly on its hinges, long forgotten, yet it almost seems to invite you to peek inside. Scholars still argue whether such hidden entrances were primarily practical escape routes. Secret meetings are, if they also served psychological purposes, heightening the thrill and tension of clandestine love. As you imagine the soft whispers exchanged behind these doors, the heartbeats, and the subtle glances, you realize that the palace itself was complicit in these dramas, its walls keeping watch over secrets that history would often prefer to ignore. Inside the private chambers, you notice letters scattered across a polished writing desk. Oddly, the handwriting is so elegant it almost seems like a work of art, the ink glinting faintly in candlelight. Scholars still debate the authenticity of such letters, some suggesting they were later embellishments by historians. Yet you can't help imagining the words themselves. Confessions of passion, promises broken, plans hatched for meetings under the moon, and fears whispered that the wrong ears might hear. Each line carries the weight of immense risk, reminding you that love within royal walls was never just an emotion. It was a gamble. You step toward a small balcony overlooking the palace courtyard, imagining secret rendezvous under the veil of night. Oddly, the shadow of a statue creates a perfect hiding spot, concealing two figures from the watchful eyes of guards or jealous rivals. Scholars still argue whether the most famous royal affairs in history were purely personal or had broader political implications. You picture the subtle hand signals, coded glances, and even gestures that might appear innocent to the untrained eye, but which conveyed entire conversations. It's a delicate dance of desire and survival, the stakes amplified by the very walls meant to protect. As you move along a moonlit walkway lined with hedges, you notice tiny carvings etched into the stone by long-forgotten lovers. Oddly, some are mere initials, others are more intricate, symbols that scholars still argue could represent secret languages, developed to maintain correspondence over years. The carvings themselves feel like ghostly fingerprints of human passion, lingering long after the lovers themselves have vanished from the historical record. Walking here, you sense the tension, the thrill, and the vulnerability of those who dared to love against the rigid codes of monarchy. You pass an arched bridge over a small koi pond, its waters reflecting the stars above. Oddly, a single red fish swims in circles, almost like a marker, a small ritual perhaps, set by the lovers to indicate safety or signal danger. Scholars still debate whether such superstitions and secret codes were common among royal couples or isolated quirks, but you can't help but feel the intimacy of these hidden systems. Each act, each secret message, every carefully planned encounter reveals a side of royalty, often absent from official chronicles, human, daring, flawed, and driven by desire. Finally, you step into a larger hall where faint echoes of past celebrations linger. Oddly, the tapestries here depict couples in intimate postures, faces obscured, yet expressions unmistakably tender. Scholars still argue whether these artworks were meant to commemorate real relationships or serve as allegories. But for you, the message is clear. Love, even in its most forbidden form, has always found a way into the corridors of power. As you stand there, listening to the faint rustle of distant curtains, you realize that the most potent stories of romance in history are rarely written in official annals. They are whispered in hidden corners, painted in shadows, and carried on the breath of those who dared to love despite the world watching. It's a training ground disguised as a chamber of comfort. Scholars still argue whether the harsh upbringing of royal children was meant to prepare them for leadership or simply a tool of control. But standing here, you can almost feel the tension hanging in the air, as if each marble floorboard remembers the footsteps of anxious heirs. The room is decorated with luxurious tapestries and gilded furniture, yet there's an unsettling precision in everything. The placement of cribs, the height of chairs, even the spacing between cushions feels like it has been calculated to instill discipline from the earliest age. Oddly, you notice miniature swords and tiny shields, lined meticulously on a shelf, not toys, but early lessons in strategy and combat. As you wander closer, you see journals left on a small desk, their pages yellowed but carefully preserved. Scholars still debate the ethics of these training methods, noting that children were often subjected to rigorous routines, sometimes bordering on cruelty, to ensure obedience and resilience. Oddly, One page details a schedule broken into minutes, not hours, with exercises in etiquette, swordplay, memorization of history, and even psychological endurance tests, like learning to sit silently for hours while observing interactions among nobles. You can almost hear the quiet sighs of children, forced to internalize the weight of dynasties long before they understood the concept of leisure or play. A faint echo drifts from the corridor, the clinking of armor, perhaps, or the rustle of robes as tutors move through the halls. Oddly, small mirrors are positioned throughout the room, angled to allow observation of the children from multiple points, without them realizing they are being watched. Scholars still argue whether these mirrors were designed for correction, psychological conditioning, or mere status display. But in walking here, you realize they served as constant reminders that the eyes of authority were never far. You imagine a young prince, no older than 6, learning to hide his fear while standing perfectly straight, rehearsing the stern. You find yourself in a high-ceiling nursery, but this is no ordinary place of lullabies and toys. Gaze that would one day command armies. In a small corner, there is a collection of carved figurines depicting battles, conquests, and triumphs. Oddly, some are incomplete or deliberately misshapen, as though to teach adaptability and problem-solving under pressure. Scholars still debate whether such manipulations were intentional pedagogical tools or incidental artistry, but the effect is clear. Even play was transformed into training, shaping young minds to navigate treacherous political landscapes. You imagine the child studying these miniatures, calculating moves and countermoves, unknowingly internalizing the strategies that might one day save or endanger entire realms. Moving toward a larger chamber, you notice subtle marks on the floor, patterns etched to guide exercises, marches, or drills. Oddly, there are tiny footprints that don't seem to match the current furnishings, suggesting earlier generations practiced the same routines. Scholars still argue whether this repetitive system strengthened loyalty and skills or simply enforced obedience. But standing here, you sense a lineage of training passed down like an unbroken chain of ritual. Children were not merely heirs. They were instruments, carefully tuned to serve the ambitions of their families. You step closer to a wall lined with portraits, each depicting young royals at different stages of development. Oddly, each portrait seems eerily similar in expression. Calm, disciplined, almost unnervingly mature for their age. Scholars still debate the psychological effects of growing up under such scrutiny, but it's undeniable that these images project an ideal blueprint for what a future ruler should be, carefully etched into memory from birth. You imagine these children internalizing these expectations, feeling the pressure of centuries weighing on small shoulders. A faint sound draws you to a small study adjacent to the nursery. The scribbling of tutors recording progress, subtle gestures of correction, whispered instructions meant to mold character and intelligence. Oddly, some notes reference exercises that seem more like tests of loyalty than education, asking children to identify friend from potential spy, ally from rival, even within their own household. Scholars still argue whether such exercises were psychologically harmful or necessary preparation, but the air in the room feels thick with tension, as though these lessons were being etched not only into memory, but into the very soul. Finally, you exit into a quiet courtyard, where statues of former royal children stand frozen in bronze, their faces serene yet eerily lifelike. Oddly, some figures show scars or signs of struggle, subtle reminders that even the most privileged heirs endured trials invisible to the outside world. Scholars still debate the line between nurture and manipulation, but standing here, you realize that these children were groomed as much for survival as for ruling, raised to wield influence, command respect, and sometimes wield power as weapons against allies and enemies alike. The quiet gravity of their upbringing lingers in the courtyard, a whisper of the costs hidden behind the splendor of royalty. You step into the dimly lit corridors of the palace once more, this time guided by a lingering scent that's almost imperceptible, the faint metallic tang of something hidden, something lethal. Scholars still argue whether poisoning in royal courts was opportunistic or a carefully honed art of political strategy. But as you move closer to the private chambers of kings and advisors, the air feels thick with secrets. Oddly, Small glass vials are tucked into niches behind tapestries, some containing powders, others faintly colored liquids, each a potential instrument of control. You imagine the careful hands that measured and administered them, a silent language of power spoken through the most delicate of gestures. The palace kitchen lies ahead, though it is no ordinary place of culinary delight. Oddly, jars of herbs, roots, and subtle tinctures line the shelves, some labeled in code, others simply by symbols that only insiders would recognize. Scholars still debate whether these ingredients were primarily medicinal, culinary, or tools for subtle assassination. You trace a fingertip along a jar marked with a tiny serpentha, symbol of caution, and feel a chill, imagining the hands of a servant or apothecary, slipping a carefully dosed potion into a goblet, a whisper of intention that could alter the course of kingdoms. You wander through a private dining hall, imagining a banquet where every dish carries a dual purpose. Oddly, the silver goblets are etched with minute symbols, possibly a signal to allies or a warning to enemies. Scholars still argue whether these markings were ritualistic, practical, or psychological, but as you picture the tense faces of courtiers and royal family members, the sense of suspense is palpable. The slightest misstep, the wrong sip, and a powerful figure could fall quietly, leaving chaos in their wake while the orchestrator remained invisible, their intentions unreadable to all but the most perceptive. A faint shadow moves across the wall in your imagination, and you follow it into a private study lined with scrolls and ledgers. Oddly, some documents detail not battles or laws, but recipes, careful measurements of herbs, minerals, and recorded with almost obsessive precision. Scholars still debate whether these recipes were medicinal or intended for more sinister uses. You imagine a monarch carefully reviewing the formula, weighing the risk, the effect, and the social ramifications, a subtle interplay of chemistry, psychology, and power role conducted in silence, with no witnesses, save perhaps a trusted confidant. You pass a hallway lined with portraits of past rulers, each gaze stern and commanding. Oddly, you notice subtle changes in their depiction over time, a faint flush to the cheeks, a subtle discoloration around the lips, signs perhaps that life in these halls was not always what it seemed. Scholars still argue whether these signs were artistic choices, accidental consequences, or evidence of more covert dangers, such as poisoning. As you imagine the hidden threats behind each ceremonial smile, it becomes clear that silence could be just as deadly as a sword, and knowledge of the palace's invisible currents was a weapon in itself. You step into a smaller chamber adjacent to the council room, imagining clandestine meetings between rulers and their closest advisors. Oddly, a single vial rests on the table, its contents shimmering faintly. Scholars still debate whether these substances were ever truly used or merely symbolic tools to intimidate and manipulate. Yet you can picture the subtle power dynamics. A ruler placing the vial in plain sight, a silent message to allies and rivals alike. That control could be exerted without overt action. The tension, the careful choreography of fear and suggestion, lingers in the imagined air, the scent of herbs and wax curls around you as you move past an inner corridor lined with tapestries, depicting victorious battles and serene landscapes. Oddly, hidden within the folds of one tapestry is a small pocket, perhaps once used to conceal tiny tools of administration or instruments of subterfuge. Scholars still argue whether such hidden compartments were practical or ritualistic, but they undoubtedly provided the means for covert communication, for quiet manipulation, and, if needed, a swift exit after a dangerous maneuver. You picture the carefully measured hand that places a letter or vial inside, each action deliberate, calculated, and silent. Finally, you pause before a massive ceremonial door leading to the throne room. Oddly, you notice that the carpets leading to the throne have tiny, almost imperceptible markings, footprints or symbols that might have been warnings to courtiers or hidden signs for loyalists. Scholars still debate whether such precautions were common or rare, but in your mind, the palace becomes a theater of subtle threats and secret languages, where poison is just another tool in the arsenal of power. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully chosen morsel could speak volumes without a single word, reminding you that in these halls, silence often carried the loudest message of all. You wander into the grand hallways of yet another palace. But tonight, the atmosphere feels heavier, tinged with unease. Scholars still debate whether the mysterious vanishings of royal heirs were accidents, political maneuvers, or darker conspiracies. But as you walk, the stories seem almost tangible, whispering through the tapestries and echoes of polished stone floors. Oddly, there are empty portraits on the wall's frames, with no faces. Names scratched, faintly on plaques that someone was here once and then disappeared from the public record. You imagine a young prince, his footsteps quiet against the marble, unaware that his very life might be measured not just by lineage, but by the whims of power and jealousy. You follow a shadowed corridor toward the nursery wing, where tiny furniture sits abandoned in stillness. Oddly, one crib has a small, hand-carved mark in the corner, almost like a tally of days someone waited, watched, or feared. Scholars still argue whether these vanishings were purely familial misfortune, accidents, or deliberate acts to remove political threats. But you can almost hear the whispers of servants who knew too much, eyes darting toward every door and window. The palace becomes alive with unseen tension, each echo carrying the weight of a story never told. As you move deeper into the wing, you find a spiral staircase descending into dimly lit service corridors. Oddly, some of the stone walls bear faint scratches, perhaps the marks of children trying to leave messages, warnings, or secret calls for help. Scholars still debate whether these marks were acts of defiance, accidental, or deliberate documentation of disappearances. But they leave you with a haunting sense of human presence, trapped in liminal spaces, just out of reach of power's eyes. You imagine the prince navigating these halls alone at night, learning lessons of survival too early, training unknowingly in stealth and caution. A faint smell of parchment and candle wax draws you toward a small chamber lined with ledgers and personal diaries. Oddly, some entries are crossed out violently, names erased, as if the writers wanted to remove evidence or protect secrets. Scholars still argue whether these edits were made to hide scandal, mistakes, or political vulnerabilities. But the careful obliteration itself tells a story that some lives were deemed expendable, their presence in history optional, their absence orchestrated with quiet precision. You feel a chill imagining the adults in charge, measuring which heirs were safe to survive, and which might disrupt a fragile balance of power. You step into the main hall, imagining it filled with courtiers and nobles, yet a strange emptiness pervades your mind's eye. Oddly, you notice faint indentations in the carpet, tiny depressions where a child's feet once stood, now gone, erased from memory yet preserved by the floor itself. Scholars still debate the frequency of such disappearances, and whether they were more common in certain dynasties or coincidental. But the pattern emerges. Heirs vanish, rumors flourish, and official records remain silent, leaving only whispers and the eerie knowledge of what might have been. As you follow the hall toward the garden terrace, the moonlight casts long shadows, turning statues into silent observers. Oddly, a small garden gate is slightly ajar, its latch broken, suggesting hurried passage or secret exits. Scholars still argue whether these princes were hidden away for protection, abducted for power struggles, or worse. You imagine midnight escapes, whispered instructions from loyal tutors, or shadowy figures moving unseen to remove the young heir from court. The palace itself becomes complicit, a maze designed to protect and conceal, but also to manipulate fate in silence. Inside a secluded library, you spot shelves with books about succession, treaties, and alliances. Oddly, one book has pages torn and stitched together with crude thread, as if someone was preserving evidence in secret. Scholars still debate whether these volumes were intended for the public, for secret councils, or for personal diaries. But you can almost see a strategist flipping pages late at night, tracking the movements, alliances, and disappearances of heirs with meticulous care. The palace, in this sense, is both archive and trap, a living witness to mysteries that remain unsolved. Finally, you emerge on a balcony overlooking the palace grounds. Oddly, the fountains and gardens below are eerily still, their symmetry almost unnatural in the moonlight. Scholars still argue whether the vanishings of princes influenced broader political instability or were contained purely within family lines. But standing here, the story is clear. Absence speaks as loudly as presence. The missing heirs, erased from official memory, continue to haunt the corridors, their secrets alive in whispers, in empty cribs, in scratched marks, and in the careful surveillance of all who remain. You shiver, realizing that even within walls of opulence, vulnerability and fear often travel faster than gold and power. You step into a darker wing of the palace, the walls lined with heavy tapestries that absorb sound and seem to carry the faint whispers of the past. Scholars still argue whether the eccentric behaviors of certain monarchs were the result of inherited mental conditions, isolation, or the intense pressures of absolute power. But as you walk, it becomes clear that madness has always lingered close to the throne. Oddly, you notice a portrait where a king's eyes seem almost misaligned, staring in two directions at once, as if painted by someone who had glimpsed the chaos beneath his composed exterior. The room feels alive, charged with the unspoken energy of rulers whose minds were never entirely their own. A faint draft guides you toward a chamber filled with ornate furniture, all positioned meticulously as if by ritual. Oddly, one chair is slightly smaller, oddly out of place, hinting at a temporary occupant or perhaps a punishment for courtiers. Scholars still debate whether this was intentional symbolism, a practical adaptation, or a reflection of the ruler's unstable mindset. You imagine the king or queen pacing the floors at night, muttering to themselves, testing advisors, and issuing commands that seem logical to no one but the sovereign. Even their laughter, you realize, could have been a calculated performance masking deep unpredictability. In a corner, a collection of objects draws your attention. Tiny dolls dressed in royal attire, miniature swords, and maps with paths scrawled in red ink. Oddly, some dolls have pins inserted at precise angles, as if manipulating them helped the ruler rehearse strategies or vent frustration safely. Scholars still argue whether these were innocent hobbies, psychological exercises, or manifestations of deeper compulsions, but the detail is unsettling. You can imagine nights spent here, alone with these miniature representations of power, plotting, imagining, and sometimes punishing imagined rivals. Moving further, you find a private study where ledgers and personal journals are stacked neatly. Oddly, certain entries are written in mirror script, forcing any casual reader to pause, and scholars still debate whether this was meant to secure privacy or a symptom of obsessive thinking. You flip through imagined pages, seeing meticulous accounts of behavior, moods, and decisions, entry both documenting and controlling reality, a way to impose order on a world that often felt chaotic. The sovereign's mind, you realize, could be as complex and unpredictable as the palace itself. You wander into a balcony overlooking the gardens. Oddly, you notice tiny clay figurines hidden among the hedges, some partially broken, some pristine. Scholars still debate whether these were talismans, toys, or secret tools for coping with paranoia. But the effect is clear. The ruler's influence extends into every corner, every object, every shadow. You picture the monarch observing from above, testing loyalty, imagining threats, creating an invisible web where every subject, servant, and visitor becomes part of an intricate psychological play. A faint sound of distant laughter seems almost unreal in the quiet corridors. Oddly, the hall mirrors reflect not one but two images of yourself, split and elongated by the angles of the glass. Scholars still argue whether these mirrors were purely decorative, instruments of self-observation, or tools to induce caution and reflection. But standing here, you feel the dizzying effect of perception and reality blending. You imagine a ruler walking these halls alone, seeing multiple versions of themselves, questioning their own sanity even as they wield unimaginable power. You approach a room with heavy curtains, where faint scribbles on the walls hint at obsessive habits, calculations, dates, or repeated phrases. Oddly, one corner contains a pile of discarded masks, each with different expressions, carved meticulously. Scholars still debate whether these masks were used in performances, private rituals, or psychological experiments on themselves and courtiers. You imagine the ruler trying on each mask in secret, rehearsing gestures, predicting reactions, and rehearsing control. A mind both brilliant and dangerously fragile. Finally, you step into a quiet hall, lined with doors leading to empty rooms. Oddly, You notice small scratches on the stone floor, almost like footsteps, pacing back and forth. Scholars still argue whether these were signs of restlessness, punishment, or mental agitation. But you feel the weight of centuries of isolation and pressure. Behind every crown lies a human mind, fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying. Madness, you realize, is not just a personal ailment. It is a companion to power, whispering advice, creating fears, and shaping history in ways both visible and hidden. You slip into the quieter servant corridors of the palace, where the walls are narrower, the ceilings lower, and the air carries the faint scent of wax and damp stone. Scholars still debate the influence of palace servants, arguing whether they were merely observers or pivotal players in royal intrigue. But as you move along, it becomes clear that these silent figures often held the keys to secrets more powerful than any crown. Oddly, small alcoves and hidden niches line the passage, places where notes could be passed, messages concealed, or clandestine meetings held without the knowledge of the ruling family. You imagine a servant clutching a letter that could topple a dynasty, balancing fear and loyalty in equal measure. You wander past kitchens, where copper pots glint faintly in the dim light. Oddly, the positioning of knives, spoons, and jars seems deliberate, almost like coded signals. Scholars still debate whether these subtle arrangements were intentional methods of communication or simply practical kitchen organization. But the possibility is chilling. You imagine a servant nudging another, whispering instructions about which foods to leave untouched, which doors to monitor, and which overheard conversations could become dangerous. Knowledge in these halls is both currency and weapon, and those who wield it must be careful not to be crushed by the weight of it. In a narrow stairwell leading to the upper floors, faint scratches line the walls, as if countless hands pressed against stone while passing hurried messages. Oddly, some marks resemble symbols, perhaps shorthand invented by servants to record observations without detection. Scholars still argue about the prevalence of such cryptography, but you can almost hear the hushed exchanges. The prince walked past the northern balcony at midnight, or the queen's confidant hides the key. Every whispered word could ripple through the palace hierarchy, influencing decisions, alliances, and betrayals. You pause outside a study, imagining the glow of candlelight inside. Oddly, you notice a tiny slit in the door, perfectly aligned with the keyhole, allowing a discreet view of whoever sits within. Scholars still debate whether such mechanisms were standard in palaces or ingenious innovations by perceptive servants, but it's easy to picture a cautious glance through that slit, observing the monarch's moods, recording secrets, and learning exactly when power was vulnerable. The tension between visibility and invisibility feels almost like a game, with the servants walking a knife's edge of knowledge and discretion. A faint echo draws you toward a chamber where scrolls and ledgers are stacked haphazardly. Oddly, some volumes have marginal notes in unfamiliar handwritings, likely servants cataloging information or clarifying instructions. Scholars still argue whether these annotations were authorized or acts of subtle rebellion, but you can imagine the invisible network of eyes and ears, silently mapping every corridor, every conversation, every potential betrayal. The palace is alive with observation, and those who know too much must navigate the treacherous line between power and punishment. You move past a small antechamber lined with mirrors. Oddly, a single mirror is angled toward a corridor, allowing servants to see without being seen themselves. Scholars still debate whether such devices were purely practical or also a psychological tool, training servants to anticipate threats and monitor movements. You imagine the quiet thrill of being privy to secrets no one else knew, of holding knowledge that could sway outcomes, yet remaining entirely invisible. In the shadows, discretion was power, and the servants wielded it with careful precision. In another narrow hallway, faint carvings etched into stone reveal personal notes, initials, and symbols. Oddly, some appear to record moments of panic or fear, perhaps when a child went missing or a clandestine meeting almost went wrong. Scholars still argue whether these were intended to be permanent or merely temporary guides, but the feeling of living history lingers. Each mark is a testament to the precarious balance between secrecy and survival, an unspoken chronicle of lives intertwined with power and intrigue. Finally, You pause at a heavy door leading to a forgotten chamber. Oddly, its hinges are greased, and the stone threshold bears subtle scratches, evidence of constant passage long before you arrive. Scholars still debate the role of these hidden spaces in palace life, but standing here, you feel the intensity of invisible influence. Servants who knew too much could save or destroy, their knowledge both a shield and a liability. And as you step back into the main corridor, the realization settles in. The palace is a stage, but those who operate behind the curtains, the servants, the observers, the silent witnesses often hold the real power. Their stories hidden in the echoes of every step. You step into the shadowed wings of a palace designed to impress and intimidate, where the gleaming halls give way to narrow, dimly lit corridors that speak of a harsher reality. Scholars still debate whether royal punishments were intended to maintain order or simply to display power. But as you move through these spaces, it becomes clear that consequences in the courts were often far more elaborate and terrifying than simple confinement or fines. Oddly, some chambers align with carved panels depicting mythical creatures and chained figures, suggesting that punishment was as much a performance as it was discipline. You imagine a young courtier trembling as a lesson in obedience is carried out, the walls themselves seeming to watch. You wander past a heavy wooden door that creaks slightly as you push it open. Oddly, inside are instruments, both practical and bizarre. Shackles adorned with intricate etchings, cages scaled for humans, yet designed like miniature thrones, and rods whose purpose remains mysterious. Scholars still argue whether such devices were primarily punitive, symbolic, or intended to instill fear as a method of psychological control. You imagine a ruler overseeing the administration of justice personally, ensuring that the punishment not only corrected, but also left a lingering lesson, visible to anyone daring to step out of line. A faint echo draws you toward a small chamber where scrolls of law and etiquette are stacked neatly on stone shelves. Oddly, some scrolls contain diagrams, illustrating punishments that seem almost theatrical, elaborate sequences intended to demonstrate authority and instill awe. Scholars still debate whether these were intended to be literal, metaphorical, or even ritualistic. But standing there, it's hard not to feel the tension that would accompany such knowledge. You picture a courtier carefully studying these texts, weighing every action against the invisible yet omnipresent authority of the sovereign. You move down a hallway lined with depicting past monarchs delivering justice. Oddly, the faces of subjects in these artworks often appear contorted with fear or resignation, a stark contrast to the calm composure of the rulers. Scholars still argue whether these paintings were propaganda, exaggeration, or faithful accounts, but the effect is undeniable. Punishment in royal courts was as much a warning to witnesses as it was a response to transgression. You imagine the silence in these corridors, broken only by the subtle shuffle of attendants, a reminder that disobedience carried consequences, far beyond the imagination of ordinary citizens. A narrow staircase leads you to a hidden chamber beneath the palace. Oddly, the walls here bear claw-like marks and small etchings that seem to document incidents of escape attempts, disobedience, or rebellion. Scholars still debate the reliability of these markings, but you can almost hear the stories of servants or young nobles who learned the cost of defiance firsthand. Even the architecture seems designed to reinforce fear. Low ceilings, winding passages, and faintly damp stone all conspire to create a psychological weight that lingers long after a sentence is passed. You step into a small antechamber filled with objects whose purposes remain obscure. Chains with oddly shaped clasps, metal collars engraved with insignia, and faintly charred remnants of ritualistic implements. Oddly, some objects bear inscriptions that hint at both correction and penance, a combination of physical restraint and moral instruction. Scholars still debate whether these items were ceremonial, practical, or a mix of both, but you can imagine their chilling effectiveness, a constant reminder that authority could manifest in ways both visible and invisible, predictable yet terrifying. In another corridor, tapestries depict scenes of humiliation and restitution, showing subjects in elaborate public punishments. Oddly, some of these images are strangely humorous, with exaggerated features and theatrical poses. hinting at a bizarre combination of fear, morality, and entertainment. Scholars still argue whether these depictions were satire, moral instruction, or psychological tools. But the effect is clear. Punishment was as much about shaping perception as it was about meeting justice. You imagine the nervous audience, each person internalizing lessons meant to maintain absolute control over behavior, both publicly and privately. Finally, you step back into the main hall, the grandeur of the palace a stark contrast to the shadowed corridors of discipline. Oddly, the transition feels almost like passing between worlds, the opulent, ceremonial side meant to impress, and the hidden, punitive spaces designed to control and terrify. Scholars still debate whether these punishments shaped long-term loyalty or bred resentment, but walking here, you sense the invisible strings of authority woven into every stone, every carving, and every echo. Royal punishment, you realize, was a language of power as precise as it was chilling, spoken silently yet understood by all who dared inhabit these halls. You step into a glittering corridor, where sunlight from towering windows bounces off gilded surfaces, casting patterns that danced across marble floors. Scholars still debate whether royal treasures were amassed purely for display or as strategic reserves of influence. But walking here, you feel the weight of centuries of accumulated wealth pressing from every corner. Oddly, the treasure rooms are not just filled with gold and jewels, but curious objects, tiny figurines of animals, intricate puzzle boxes, and mysterious locked chests whose keys seem to have vanished with time. You imagine a king or queen handling these items in secret, not merely for pleasure, but as tools to manipulate alliances and maintain dominance. You wander past a chamber where ceremonial crowns and scepters rest on velvet pedestals. Oddly, each item bears subtle carvings, symbols, initials, and secret messages, some so small they are nearly invisible. Scholars still debate whether these markings were intended to track ownership, signify alliances, or encode hidden warnings. But you can picture a monarch carefully inspecting a crown, aware that even the smallest detail could influence loyalty or betrayal. The opulence is breathtaking, yet it feels deliberate, a visual language designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. A faint metallic scent draws you toward a row of ornate cabinets, filled with gemstones and rare coins. Oddly, some gemstones are embedded with tiny inscriptions or miniature engravings of historical events, almost like a diary in stone. Scholars still argue whether these engravings were symbolic, commemorative, or practical in tracking wealth, but the effect is mesmerizing. You imagine the ruler running fingers across the smooth surfaces, feeling the stories encoded in these treasures, each piece carrying power, prestige, and subtle lessons in history. You move into a narrower passage, where the floor is lined with soft rugs to muffle footsteps. Oddly, a single chest appears out of place, smaller and less adorned than its neighbors. Scholars still debate whether such inconspicuous treasures were for personal indulgence, bribes, or secret payments to allies. You imagine a monarch opening his chest only in solitude, a private indulgence hidden from the eyes of courtiers and chroniclers alike. Perhaps it contained objects of obsession, rare perfumes, delicate fabrics, or tokens of forbidden relationships, each chosen with care and secrecy. In a high-ceiling vault, scrolls documenting the origin of each treasure are meticulously arranged. Oddly, some scrolls are intentionally blank, with only faint impressions of writing visible under the right light. Scholars still argue whether these blanks were intentional omissions, coded records, or attempts to obscure scandalous acquisitions. But you can sense the tension in each page. Even in wealth, discretion mattered, and the power of knowing what treasures existed and who truly controlled them was as potent as the gold itself. You pause before a display of ceremonial armor, inlaid with gold and precious stones. Oddly, one breastplate bears tiny scratches across the surface, not from battle, but from careful, deliberate etching, almost like a signature. Scholars still debate whether these marks represented personal victories, warnings to rivals, or secret rituals. But standing here, you realize that every piece of treasure tells a story beyond mere wealth. They are physical embodiments of power, obsession, and the meticulous orchestration of influence. Moving to a side chamber, you notice a set of small boxes, each containing delicate miniature paintings and rare gemstones. Oddly, one box has a hidden compartment beneath its lining, perhaps used to conceal forbidden items or correspondence. Scholars still argue whether these hidden spaces were practical, playful, or instruments of intrigue, but the imagination conjures scenes of monarchs slipping notes or bribes, making deals and secrets flow as quietly as the gold glinting in their hands. Every object becomes a player in the silent game of power. Finally, you stand before the largest vault, its door massive and imposing. Oddly, the lock has been designed with multiple intricate tumblers, impossible to pick without precise knowledge. Scholars still debate whether such security measures were purely defensive or also symbolic, a demonstration of control and ingenuity. You imagine a ruler turning the key, revealing the heart of their kingdom's hidden wealth, every coin, jewel, and object carrying silent messages of authority, preference, and secret influence. In these halls, treasures were not just for admiration, they were instruments, warnings, and whispers of the palace's invisible rules, speaking volumes without ever uttering a word. You step into a secluded ceremonial hall, its walls lined with faded tapestries depicting past monarchs, raising goblets in solemn ritual. Scholars still debate whether these poison-related ceremonies were symbolic, punitive, or practical methods of control. But as you move closer, the atmosphere thickens with tension, as if the very air remembers whispered warnings and secret sips. Oddly, small silver chalices rest on pedestals, gleaming faintly under candlelight, each engraved with tiny markings that could signify allegiance, rank, or something far darker. You imagine a courtier or trusted advisor standing nervously nearby, aware that even a moment's lapse could be fatal. The hall stretches on, faintly echoing with imagined footsteps. Oddly, the floor is inlaid with patterns that resemble snakes winding toward the throne, a subtle reminder that danger can slither from even the most seemingly benign direction. Scholars still argue whether these designs were purely decorative or intended to reinforce psychological tension, but you feel the intended effect, an undercurrent of suspense, a silent lesson in vigilance for all who dare approach the center of power. Each step becomes measured, deliberate, conscious of unseen eyes and invisible threats. You pause before a long, narrow table covered with ornate goblets and vessels. Oddly, one chalice bears an unusual iridescence, a subtle shimmer hinting at something hidden beneath the surface. Scholars still debate whether traces of poison were ever actually used in such ceremonies or if the rituals themselves served as demonstrations of loyalty and obedience. You imagine a monarch raising the goblet, eyes scanning the room, reading subtle cues of fear, trust, and betrayal. The power of suggestion, you realize, can be as lethal as any toxin, and perception often outweighs reality in the delicate theater of court intrigue. Moving to the far end of the hall, you notice a small alcove where jars of herbs and powders sit in shadow. Oddly, each jar carries a symbol carved into the lid, a crescent moon, a serpent, a sunburst potential codes, decipherable only by those within the inner circle. Scholars still argue whether these symbols indicated the type of poison, its potency, or simply acted as ritualistic elements to intimidate observers. You imagine a master of ceremonies handling the substances with precision, measuring intentions as carefully as ingredients, each movement loaded with meaning that could alter loyalties or end careers. You wander past ceremonial tapestries that depict kings and queens dining together, yet subtle details hint at tension. A slightly turned goblet, a hand hovering near another's arm, eyes cast sideways in silent warning. Oddly, the figure's facial expressions carry tiny asymmetries that scholars still debate are they artistic quirks or evidence of actual fear and hesitation. Observed by the painter, you imagine the ritual itself as a test, not only of loyalty, but of composure, forcing participants to navigate subtle threats while maintaining appearances of grace and control. A faint metallic scent draws you to the floor near a throne-like chair. Oddly, a small recess in the armrest holds a miniature vial, empty now, but once containing a substance intended to influence decisions, calm nerves, or instill fear. Scholars still debate the prevalence of such practices, whether they were widespread across kingdoms or limited to elite courts. but the implications are chilling. The monarch could manipulate mood, test loyalty, or teach obedience, all without drawing a single sword or uttering a word. You move to a side corridor where secret doors open into private observation chambers. Oddly, one panel allows a hidden viewer to watch the ritual unfold from a shadowed vantage point. Scholars still argue whether these viewing spaces were architectural necessities, surveillance tools, or psychological tactics, but you can almost see a counselor observing reactions, recording and subtly influencing outcomes. The ceremony becomes a living lesson in power, psychology, and control, blending performance, ritual, and strategy into a single, invisible game. Finally, you step into the central space again, the goblets gleaming under the flickering candlelight. Oddly, one cup rests slightly off-center, as though deliberately placed to draw attention or unsettle the participant. Scholars still debate whether the slight deviations were intended to mark status, test perception, or signal secret alliances. Standing here, you sense the full tension of the ritual. Trust, fear, observation, and manipulation intertwined in a dance as delicate and deadly as any battle. In these halls, a chalice is more than a cup, it is a symbol, a test, and a weapon, and those who navigate it carefully may survive, while the unwary could vanish quietly into history's shadows. You slip through a narrow, candlelit corridor where the walls are etched with faint symbols, almost imperceptible in the flickering light. Scholars still debate whether hidden chambers were constructed for practical purposes, secret meetings, or even ritualistic use. But as you move forward, the sense of mystery grows palpable. Oddly, some doors appear to open into nothing at first glance. Yet careful inspection reveals false panels, hinges concealed within decorative molding. You imagine a monarch slipping behind these doors, entering rooms unseen by anyone, to make decisions, meet allies, or simply escape the watchful eyes of the court. The hallway opens into a labyrinth of interconnected chambers, each dimly lit and strangely silent. Oddly, the furniture seems unusually small and movable, almost as if it could be reconfigured at a moment's notice. Scholars still argue whether these rooms were meant for hiding, espionage, or private study, but you can picture clandestine gatherings taking place here, whispered conversations, secret agreements, and subtle negotiations that might determine the fate of kingdoms. Every creak of the floor and shadow along the wall becomes a potential signal, a reminder that in these hidden spaces, perception is as crucial as reality. You pause before a low doorway, leading into a room filled with ancient artifacts and ceremonial objects. Oddly, many items are arranged not for display but in precise, almost ritualistic patterns. Scholars still debate whether these arrangements were protective, symbolic, or simply organizational, but the effect is uncanny. You imagine a royal advisor kneeling here at night, consulting symbols, maps, or objects to make sense of political intrigue or personal rivalries. The hidden chambers are alive with history, each object quietly bearing witness to schemes and secrets. Moving along a spiral staircase that descends further underground, you notice narrow slits in the walls, allowing faint glimpses into adjoining rooms. Oddly, these slits appear intentionally aligned, suggesting surveillance or observation was a deliberate part of the chamber's design. Scholars still argue whether this was a common architectural feature or a specific innovation of select royal palaces, but you can almost hear a whispered conversation carried through these openings, a secret pass between courtiers or confidants without detection. The palace itself becomes a silent accomplice to intrigue, the walls storing knowledge as carefully as the monarchs who walk them. In a dimly lit library hidden deep within the chambers, scrolls and manuscripts are stacked in haphazard order. Oddly, some documents are annotated in different hands, often with cryptic symbols or shorthand only known to trusted aides. Scholars still debate whether these annotations were instructions, warnings, or personal notes, but the sense of controlled knowledge is unmistakable. You imagine a royal figure poring over these texts, uncovering plots, planning alliances, and controlling outcomes from behind layers of secrecy, each discovery shaping the power dynamics within and beyond the palace. You step into a small alcove where a miniature fountain trickles gently, providing both ambience and a subtle masking of sound. Oddly, the fountain seems disproportionately large for the space, almost like a deliberate distraction. Scholars still argue whether these water features were purely decorative, practical, or served as a sound cover for covert meetings. But you can picture a clandestine discussion taking place here, voices hushed and gestures subtle, while the gentle rush of water conceals their secrets. In these hidden chambers, even natural elements are enlisted in the service of secrecy. A faint draft carries the scent of herbs and wax into a further corridor. Oddly, small niches along the walls contain jars, vials, and other curiosities, some empty, some still containing remnants of powders or liquids. Scholars still debate the intended use of these items, whether medicinal, ritualistic, or manipulative. But standing here, you sense the potential for both protection and threat. Perhaps a monarch experimented in isolation, tested loyalty, or administered subtle influence, all unseen, all deliberate. Finally, you arrive at a heavily reinforced door at the heart of the labyrinth. Oddly, the hinges are hidden, and the surface bears faint symbols, indicating something sacred or forbidden inside. Scholars still argue whether the inner chamber served as a sanctuary, treasury, or secret council room. But you can almost hear the echoes of conversations, laughter, whispers, and scheming that have passed through this space for centuries. Hidden royal chambers, you realize, are more than rooms. They are instruments of power, silence, and strategy, safeguarding secrets that might have reshaped history if ever revealed. You step into a vast, echoing gallery where portraits of royal siblings line the walls, their eyes following your every move. Scholars still debate whether rivalries among royal siblings were inevitable due to succession pressures or fueled deliberately by cunning advisors. But as you wander, it becomes clear that blood ties could be as dangerous as any external enemy. Oddly, some portraits feature subtle asymmetries, a hand slightly raised, a shadow cast just so teeny hints of whispered alliances or secret resentments. You imagine siblings pacing these halls at night, plotting and counterplotting while the palace slept, each one aware that trust is as fragile as the finest porcelain. A faint draft carries the smell of aged parchment from a nearby study. Oddly, scattered letters are tied with colored ribbons, red for warning, blue for reassurance, green perhaps signaling conspiracy. Scholars still argue whether these were actual communication codes or later interpretations by historians, but you can picture a young prince or princess quietly exchanging notes under candlelight, each word carefully chosen, each line a subtle maneuver in the delicate game of survival and supremacy. The weight of history presses down. In royal families, affection and enmity often shared the same room. You wander past a balcony overlooking a marble courtyard. Oddly, footsteps echo faintly, though no one is there, perhaps the ghosts of past siblings, walking their own secret paths. Scholars still debate whether tales of sibling treachery were exaggerated by chroniclers or rooted in real plots. But the palace itself seems to suggest a tense choreography of alliances, betrayals, and quiet observation. You imagine secret meetings beneath the moon, hushed conversations that could determine succession or exile, love and rivalry entwined in the shadows. In a private sitting room, a collection of miniature figures and game boards lies untouched on a table. Oddly, pieces are arranged in patterns that don't match standard play, perhaps reflecting past strategies for domination or survival. Scholars still argue whether such games were training in political thinking or mere pastimes. But standing here, you can see how even leisure could be weaponized. A rehearsal for intrigue, a practice in manipulation, a simulation of betrayal and alliance among siblings. The palace becomes a stage where childhood and politics entwine seamlessly. A small corridor leads to chambers with personal belongings, embroidered slippers, delicate combs, jeweled hairpins. Oddly, some items bear scratches or marks, seemingly documenting ownership disputes, hurried exchanges, or acts of sabotage. Scholars still debate whether these were intentional records, subtle messages, or accidents, but they remind you that even objects could be instruments of rivalry. You imagine a sibling hiding a trinket to signal loyalty, conceal evidence, or gain leverage over another, the smallest act rippling through the web of courtly politics. You move into a library where scrolls of family, genealogy, and succession plans lie side by side. Oddly, some pages are deliberately blank or scratched out, perhaps to erase inconvenient errors or obscure scandals. Scholars still argue whether these edits were deliberate manipulation or clerical oversight, but you feel the gravity of power held in ink. Brothers and sisters navigate not just emotions, but official records, understanding that history itself could be weaponized as much as any sword. In a quiet antechamber, whispers seem to linger like smoke. Oddly, a hidden slot in the wall contains folded letters, half-burnt and fragile, revealing hints of plots, alliances, and betrayals. Scholars still debate the authenticity of such fragments, yet imagining them sparks the tension of a royal household where loyalty is tested. Words are measured, and every move carries consequences. You picture siblings observing one another, masking fear with poise, plotting quietly while the kingdom's stability trembles in their hands. Finally, you step back into the gallery, surrounded by portraits whose gazes feel almost alive. Oddly, some eyes seem to follow each other, hinting at unrecorded alliances or secret animosities. Scholars still argue whether sibling betrayal defined dynastic decline or was merely an occasional hazard, but you understand the delicate balance. Love, envy, ambition, and survival intertwined in a private, invisible theater. In royal families, the most dangerous adversary is often someone with your own blood, and whispers can be as sharp as swords. You step into the quieter chambers adjacent to the throne room, where sunlight filters through heavy drapes and dust motes, float like tiny dancers in the warm air. Scholars still debate the real power wielded by royal mistresses, whether their influence was purely personal, political, or a subtle combination of both. But standing here, you can feel the weight of unseen control. Oddly, small doors lead into private parlors, each decorated lavishly, yet designed for secrecy rather than display. You imagine a mistress entering with quiet confidence, her movements measured, eyes scanning for opportunity, lips hinting at secrets that could tilt the balance of power. You wander past gilded mirrors, reflecting the corridors and yourself, yet oddly, they seem to hide more than they reveal. Scholars still argue whether the physical proximity of mistresses to monarchs was a strategic placement or a symbol of personal favor. But in these halls, closeness equals influence. You picture whispered counsel, casual suggestions that subtly shift decisions, and quiet interventions that shape alliances. Even a smile at the right moment could shift loyalties, and a disapproving glance might seal someone's fate. In a private sitting room, delicate furniture bears subtle signs of use. Cushions slightly indented, silk curtains tugged just so. Oddly, journals left open hint at personal observations. Alliances, jealousies, and minor intrigues recorded with careful attention. Scholars still debate whether these records were for personal amusement or clandestine leverage, but they give you a vivid image of a mistress who knew how to wield knowledge without overt confrontation. Influence here is invisible yet absolute, exercised through proximity, timing, and perception. A faint scent of perfume draws you down a corridor lined with tapestries depicting historical court scenes. Oddly, some figures are shown leaning closer than necessary, exchanging subtle gestures that scholars still argue could be symbolic of political manipulation or purely decorative. You imagine the mistress moving through these spaces, reading gestures, interpreting intent, and gently nudging outcomes and directions favorable to her ambitions or her sovereign's desires. Her presence, though officially unofficial, is a silent current shaping every decision around the throne. You step into a secluded garden courtyard where fountains tinkle softly. Oddly, a small pavilion sits tucked in a corner, just enough to allow private meetings without being observed. Scholars still debate whether such spaces were primarily for romance, strategy, or ritualized influence, but you picture discreet conversations occurring here, instructions, suggestions, and subtle manipulations that ripple through the palace. Hierarchy, without anyone ever noticing. Even the wind through the leaves becomes an accomplice, carrying messages too delicate for official channels. Inside an adjoining chamber, a collection of letters and trinkets hints at both affection and strategy. Oddly, Some letters are written in code or shorthand, accessible only to those in the inner circle. Scholars still argue whether these were practical measures or playful exercises in secrecy, but the effect is undeniable. The mistress becomes both confidant and manipulator, influencing alliances, decisions, and even the shaping of heirs from behind a veneer of intimacy. Every small gesture, adjusting a sleeve, leaning slightly forward, or sharing a seemingly trivial observation, becomes a tool for power. You wander past private galleries displaying gifts, some delicate, some extravagant. Oddly, one display contains miniature portraits hidden inside ornate boxes, suggesting clandestine admiration or discreet communication. Scholars still debate whether these tokens were expressions of loyalty, affection, or calculated influence. But you can almost see the mistress carefully selecting and presenting each gift, aware of the subtle messages each carries. Influence here is quiet, nuanced, and intimate, exercised through observation, timing, and strategic proximity. Finally, you step back into the hallways where courtiers pass silently. Oddly, shadows fall across the floors in patterns that almost seem designed to protect certain routes or conceal movement. Scholars still argue whether these architectural choices were intentional for privacy or coincidental, but the effect is clear. The mistress navigates a delicate web of perception, influence, and secrecy. In these corridors, power is exercised not through decrees or force, but through soft whispers, keen observation, and the ability to make every presence felt without ever being formally acknowledged. The palace, you realize, is as much a stage for subtle dominion as it is for overt authority. You step into a dim chamber filled with shadows that stretch unnaturally along the walls, the faint scent of incense and old wax curling around your senses. Scholars still debate whether royal curses and superstitions were genuine beliefs, theatrical tools of control, or deliberate manipulations to instill fear. But standing here, you can almost feel their lingering presence. Oddly, small talismans, tiny carved animals, amulets, and scraps of parchment inscribed with strange symbols are scattered across shelves and alcoves. You imagine a monarch handling these objects with a mix of reverence and strategy, believing or pretending to believe in their power while subtly directing the court's behavior through fear of unseen consequences. A faint draft leads you to a corner where shelves contain jars of herbs, powders, and peculiar minerals. Oddly, each jar carries a different symbol, some suns, moons, or stars perhaps intended to ward off misfortune or attract favor. Scholars still argue whether these items were ritualistic, medicinal, or strategic tools, but the combination of mystery and opulence suggests that superstition served multiple purposes: comfort, influence, and intimidation. You picture a king or queen carefully sprinkling a powder or displaying a talisman, sending subtle messages to courtiers about loyalty, trust, or impending judgment. You wander past a tapestry depicting a dramatic royal funeral. Oddly, the deceased's eyes are painted slightly open, a detail scholars still debate as either artistic convention or symbolic protection against restless spirits. You imagine the monarchs observing such rituals, taking lessons in power, fear, and the careful performance of grief. Superstition, in this sense, becomes a tool, a way to maintain control, enforce loyalty, or create invisible consequences for those who might consider stepping out of line. In a small antechamber, miniature effigies of royal adversaries sit on shelves, some pierced with pins or partially broken. Oddly, the placement and condition of these figures suggest ritualistic intent, though scholars still debate whether they were symbolic, therapeutic, or designed to influence political outcomes. You imagine the sovereign handling these effigies carefully, focusing intentions on rivals while teaching observers the subtle lesson that unseen forces can have real consequences. The practice blurs the line between belief, manipulation, and performance. A narrow corridor leads you to a hidden alcove where faintly burned candles cast flickering shadows. Oddly, some candles are shaped like tiny crowns or animals, each corresponding to an individual within the court. Scholars still argue whether these were superstitious, ritualistic, or psychological instruments to assert control. But standing here, you can almost hear the quiet counting of flames, the careful observance of shapes, and the deliberate timing of rituals meant to send warnings without words. Fear, you realize, can be as persuasive as any law. You move past a display of charms and small scrolls containing indecipherable symbols. Oddly, some scrolls are rolled inside hollowed figurines or hidden beneath layers of cloth, suggesting secrecy and discretion. Scholars still debate whether these were protective spells, personal talismans, or coded political messages, but the effect is undeniable. The palace becomes a theater of unseen forces, where superstition reinforces authority, guides behavior, and shapes perception. You imagine courtiers glancing nervously at charms, careful not to offend unseen powers or the monarch who wields them. A faint echo of footsteps guides you to a chamber filled with mirrors, each angled slightly differently. Oddly, some mirrors have faint inscriptions along their edges, perhaps intended to trap, reflect, or observe unseen energies. Scholars still argue whether such devices were meant for spiritual protection, magical practice, or psychological influence. But the overall impression is clear. Perception is manipulated at every turn. You picture the monarch moving among mirrors, arranging objects, consulting talismans, and directing belief as both tool and shield. Finally, you pause in the center of the largest hall, where shadows stretch long and silent. Oddly, tiny figurines litter the floor, some placed in patterns that suggest ritual or warning. Scholars still debate whether these rituals had real effect, symbolic meaning, or strategic value. But standing here, you feel the palpable tension of centuries of superstition, intertwined with authority, royal curses, and superstitions. You realize were never just for belief, they were instruments of influence, shaping decisions, instilling caution, and weaving an invisible net of power over all who dwelled within the palace. You wander into a wing of the palace that smells faintly of polished wood and aged perfume. The walls lined with portraits of brides and grooms, their faces frozen in ceremonial smiles. Scholars still debate whether royal marriages were acts of genuine affection or calculated political strategy, but standing here, you can almost feel the invisible threads of alliances stretching across kingdoms. Oddly, some portraits depict couples whose eyes seem slightly diverted, glances hinting at unease, awkwardness, or even subtle resistance. You imagine young royals navigating these arranged unions, their personal desires secondary to the careful balance of power and diplomacy. A faint draft carries the scent of roses and candle wax, guiding you to a private balcony overlooking a manicured garden. Oddly, small fountains are arranged to form intricate patterns visible only from above, perhaps signaling secret meetings or messages to visitors. Scholars still argue whether such architectural choices were ornamental or functional, but you can picture clandestine discussions taking place here, courtiers negotiating dowry, alliances being solidified, and subtle threats whispered under the cover of floral scent and moonlight. Marriage, in this sense, becomes both a personal union and a political tool, binding hearts and nations in silent contract. You pass through a corridor where delicate tapestries depict wedding processions, each figure adorned with symbols that scholars still debate markers of loyalty, status, or hidden alliances. Oddly, some figures are repeated across tapestries, as if to emphasize a secret connection or reinforce a bond of influence. You imagine advisors guiding young royals through these unions, carefully explaining protocol, while subtly instructing them on the power, dynamics hidden behind ceremonial smiles. Even a slight misstep could disrupt alliances or embolden rivals, and every gesture carries weight. A private sitting room draws your attention, its walls lined with gifts, letters, and tokens exchanged between royal families. Oddly, one drawer contains miniature portraits folded to fit in tiny envelopes, hinting at secret correspondence or subtle negotiations. Scholars still debate whether such items were personal, diplomatic, or covert instruments of influence. But the effect is clear. Marriage was not only a social ritual, but also a network of political strategy, subtly influencing loyalties, inheritance, and succession. You imagine courtiers carefully recording every detail, aware that small gestures could ripple across borders and decades. You move into a narrow staircase leading to upper chambers. Oddly, faint carvings line the handrails, perhaps initials of couples or symbols representing secret pacts. Scholars still argue whether these carvings were celebratory, ritualistic, or coded messages, but you can almost hear whispered discussions of treaties, the careful alignment of heirs, and the quiet reinforcement of family alliances. The palace itself becomes an accomplice, architecture subtly guiding behavior, enforcing hierarchy and safeguarding secrecy. In a secluded garden pavilion, candles flicker softly. Oddly, small notes tied with colored ribbons are pinned to nearby plants, each perhaps carrying instructions, observations, or coded advice. Scholars still debate whether these were practical communications, ritualistic gestures, or instruments of influence. But you imagine a young royal reading and responding in silence, their every choice monitored and guided. Even the soft rustle of leaves might carry significance, signaling, timing, loyalty, or a discreet warning. You wander past a corridor of mirrors, reflecting gilded doors and tapestries. Oddly, some mirrors are angled to catch glances from unseen observers, allowing discreet monitoring of interactions during private meetings. Scholars still argue whether these architectural choices were security measures, psychological tools, or subtle demonstrations of surveillance, but the effect is undeniable. Every encounter, every touch, every gesture is observed and recorded, shaping alliances as much as any treaty. Finally, you step into a grand hall where a wedding banquet might have taken place. Oddly, the tables are arranged in precise symmetry, with hidden compartments beneath some chairs. Scholars still debate whether these concealed spaces were for messages, gifts, or even discreet bribes. But standing here, you sense the full orchestration of power. Royal marriages, you realize, were more than unions of hearts. They were instruments of diplomacy, secrecy, and influence, subtly dictating the fate of kingdoms, while participants navigated a maze of protocol, expectation, and unseen consequence. You step into a long, dimly lit gallery lined with portraits of heirs who never ascended the throne, their painted eyes following you like silent witnesses. Scholars still debate why so many young royals vanished in European courts to sea. Accidents, political elimination, or sheer misfortune, but walking here, the mystery feels tangible, almost alive in the echo of your footsteps. Oddly, some portraits have been scratched or partially painted over, as if someone tried to erase their memory, a subtle act that leaves traces of both care and fear. You imagine a young prince or princess wandering these halls, unaware that survival often depended more on luck than lineage. A faint chill draws you toward a smaller chamber where faded ledgers record births, deaths, and disappearances. Oddly, some entries are smudged, dates altered, or notes added in secret margins, leaving scholars to still debate their accuracy and intent. You picture cautious scribes copying records by candlelight, knowing that a single misstep or revealing to much could endanger themselves or those they chronicled. The act of writing becomes both preservation and manipulation, a silent negotiation between truth and survival. You pass a corridor where servants' quarters line the walls. Oddly, some floors bear scratches and dents, evidence of hurried movement, whispered messages, or secret escapes. Scholars still argue whether these vanishings were orchestrated by jealous relatives, ambitious advisors, or simply the cruelties of fate. But you can almost feel the tension in every step. A child carefully counting the distance between rooms, memorizing safe routes, and learning to vanish into shadows at the slightest threat. Every corner of the palace is both refuge and trap. In a narrow stairwell, faint drawings of keys, doors, and windows have been etched into the stone by invisible hands. Oddly, some symbols appear repeatedly, suggesting hidden passages or escape plans, though scholars still debate whether they were practical or imaginative exercises. You imagine the young heirs memorizing these secret signs, aware that knowledge of the palace itself could mean life or death. The walls become a silent guide, preserving secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. You pause before a small study filled with diaries and letters. Oddly, some letters were never sent, folded neatly and tucked into drawers, their words hinting at fear, jealousy, or secret alliances. Scholars still argue whether these notes reflect actual political intrigue or were expressions of personal anxiety. But standing here, you feel the weight of lives lost too soon. The heir's absence leaves an invisible void, felt not only in official records, but in the very architecture and rhythm of palace life. A hidden garden at the end of the hall catches your attention. Oddly, the gates show faint marks of climbing, scratches that suggest secret exits or clandestine meetings. Scholars still debate whether heirs disappeared voluntarily, were spirited away for protection, or eliminated by rivals. But imagining midnight, escapes, and hushed instructions gives the space an almost cinematic tension. Every rustle of leaves and moonlit shadow carries the possibility of peril or freedom. You move past the gallery where portraits of surviving monarchs contrast sharply with their absent siblings. Oddly, the frames of the missing heirs seem intentionally smaller or slightly misaligned, as if to minimize their presence or acknowledge a delicate erasure. Scholars still argue whether these choices were accidental, symbolic, or deliberate acts of political revisionism. But you can almost hear the hushed stories of those who knew the truth, passing warnings in whispers and coded glances. The palace itself becomes a repository of secrets, memory, and absence. Finally, you stand in the central hall where ceremonial announcements might have been made. Oddly, faint indentations in the marble floor suggest hastily moved furniture, rushed footsteps, or secret meetings that left no trace in official accounts. Scholars still debate whether the vanishing heirs influenced succession crises or broader political instability, but you feel the human story behind the history. Fear, ambition, manipulation, and survival intertwined in every empty room. The heirs who vanished remain present in the palace's echoes, their absence shaping legacies, alliances, and the silent dance of power that continues behind gilded doors. You step into the palace's innermost vaults, where the air feels thick and still, carrying the scent of stone, aged wood, and faint incense from centuries past. Scholars still debate how many secrets were intentionally buried by monarchs' hidden chambers, erased records, or concealed treasures, but standing here, the weight of untold history presses on your senses. Oddly, small alcoves hold objects that seem almost trivial. A broken toy, a half-burnt candle, a miniature box with an illegible inscription. You imagine rulers meticulously selecting which items, stories, and people would vanish from memory, leaving only fragments for the future to uncover. You wander past a low doorway leading into a dimly lit room filled with stacked scrolls and sealed jars. Oddly, some containers are partially covered in dust. Others seem untouched for centuries, yet all radiate a sense of importance. Scholars still argue whether these materials were hidden to protect knowledge, manipulate posterity, or erase scandals. But the effect is chilling. You picture a monarch personally overseeing the concealment of sensitive letters, political records, or evidence of intimate indiscretions. Each item a calculated choice, shaping how history would remember them or not. A faint echo draws you to a corner where the walls are engraved with faint symbols, partially obscured by time. Oddly, some markings resemble star charts or cryptic diagrams, though scholars still debate their purpose: navigate, ritual, or coded communication. You imagine the monarchs using these markings as guides to safeguard the truly sensitive, creating secret maps of influence and concealment only they could interpret. Each etched line becomes a silent instruction, a reminder that some truths were never meant for the light of day. You pass through a narrow hallway where faded tapestries hang, each embroidered with figures frozen mid-action. Oddly, a few faces are deliberately obscured or stitched over, suggesting an intentional erasure of identity. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, punitive, or an effort to protect reputations, but the effect is undeniable. Even art becomes a vessel for secrecy, silently recording the choices of those who controlled memory itself. You picture the monarch carefully approving or altering each depiction, aware that perception and legacy are inseparable from power. In a secluded chamber, a set of small chests contains personal effects, rings, miniature scrolls, and delicate objects of unknown purpose. Oddly, some are empty, their contents deliberately removed, leaving only the vessel as a testament to what once existed. Scholars still debate whether these omissions were practical, ceremonial, or psychological, but the act of erasure itself is telling. You imagine a ruler marking certain truths as too dangerous to preserve, quietly removing them from view, creating gaps in the narrative that would confuse, intimidate, or control those who came after. You wander toward a larger hall, where faint carvings on the floor hint at hidden compartments. Oddly, some sections have been intentionally obscured with decorative rugs or furniture, and scholars still debate whether these were meant to protect treasures, documents, or bodies. Standing here, you imagine the meticulous care required to seal away secrets, a ledger of conspiracies, a forbidden diary, or the spoils of a politically inconvenient conquest. Each hidden element represents a story selectively silenced, shaping not only history, but the perception of the monarch who commanded it. A faint shimmer of light leads you to a niche containing a small, covered mirror. Oddly, the glass appears intentionally clouded, reflecting only vague shapes. Scholars still argue whether mirrors were employed as tools of reflection, ritual, or concealment, but you can imagine its purpose: to obscure, to guard secrets, and perhaps to remind those who approach that some truths are better left unseen. The objects here sealed, erased, or distorted act as vessels of power, controlling knowledge, memory, and influence. Finally, you step into the heart of the vaults, where the air grows heavy with the accumulation of hidden choices, erased records, and buried memories. Oddly, the room feels alive with the faint hum of centuries of secrets, and scholars still debate whether the sheer volume of what was hidden shapes how we understand history today. You feel it, all the vanished heirs, the silent mistresses, the poisoned chalices, and the hidden chambers woven into a web that defines legacy. The final secrets, you realize, were not merely objects or documents, they were carefully curated absences, a deliberate silence that echoes louder than any proclamation, shaping the story of the palace, the monarchy, and the world beyond its walls. As you step away from the innermost vaults, the corridors gradually soften around you, candlelight flickers gently, and shadows stretch like sleepy fingers across the stone floors. Outside, a gentle breeze stirs the drapes, carrying the scent of old gardens and distant rain. You feel the hush of centuries pressing lightly, but not oppressively, more like a whisper, inviting you to breathe slowly and let the story settle. The echoes of vanished heirs, secret alliances, royal mistresses, and hidden treasures fade into a quiet hum, as if the palace itself exhales. You find a chair near a softly glowing window, and the world beyond seems distant, muted. Every secret, every intrigue, every whispered betrayal now drifts like a feather, light and contained, reminding you that even the heaviest stories can rest. Take a moment to notice your own heartbeat, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of a palace long abandoned yet alive in memory. The flicker of candlelight dances on the walls, shadows blending with the soft hum of the night. You feel yourself untangling from centuries of intrigue, from whispers of betrayal and hidden power, letting the palace, its echoes, and its secrets settle quietly behind you. Now, as you close your eyes and exhale softly, imagine the palace doors swinging gently shut, the secrets resting, the corridors hushed. Sleep drifts toward you, gentle and deep, as though the walls themselves are tucking you into the calm after centuries of restless whispers. End of script. Sweet dreams,